Today I'm going to try to draw this facade in Tallinn, Estonia, and I'm going to bury the lead for just a bit. I won't tell you exactly what's about to happen, but let's get into some of the things that made this drawing, let's say, increasingly frustrating by the minute. So let's start off by observing this reference. It's a nice yellow building with a quaint little doorway, which is what I'm getting started with here. There's some dappled light on the left, which I think adds a great deal of intrigue. And if you're thinking, well, he doesn't understand the first thing about dappled light, so that must be what he had trouble with, you'd be wrong. Well, you'd be right, and you'd be wrong. I do have a very hard time understanding how to draw dappled light. It still evades me, and I imagine it will for some time. But that's not what made this a problem. In fact, I barely registered it was there at all, if you can believe it. So moving on. There are some nice shadows, particularly below the door, and they do seem kind of complicated, but I guess we'll see about that. Windows, you might be thinking. There are many, and we know he doesn't exactly jive with those. First of all, please stop bullying me. And once again, you'd be correct, and yet not. I also completely ignore the windows. The door itself looks pretty ornate, lots of little details in there, but that's not too high a hurdle, and it's actually one of the components that I was excited about drawing. So with those things out of the way, nothing here, I would think, seems all that difficult or apparently frustrating, and that's true. If anything, I would have thought that the dappled light would be the only thing here that would really hinder my success, but no. It's actually many other things, or a few other things, that ultimately ruin this drawing experience for me. So much so that I outright quit. It wasn't the end of the drawing. There was a lot more to do, but I made it end anyway. I just couldn't take it anymore. I just stopped midway through the drawing, as you'll see. And that's the first time this has happened. And if I do this for much longer, I imagine not the last. So, what about this drawing made me give up? Well, as you can see, it's definitely not the right side of this door because I seem to be having a pretty good time drawing it, paying attention to the details while not getting swept up in, carefully copying them one to one. But while I make my way through this part, I can spill a few of the beans and say that the setup of the video for this drawing was an immense pain in the neck, which is kind of a running theme at this point. Thankfully, I have my wife to help me set these up, or else I wouldn't be able to properly frame anything. But because I make these videos all over the place, setting up the tripod can be not very exciting. Sometimes it's like the uneven ground, like cobblestones or roots. Sometimes it's on an incline. Sometimes the background is distracting, so I have to move around. There are so many, way too many variables when getting this shot set up. And when you have someone as picky as me dictating how I want things to look, let's just say I'm grateful for her patience. Quick sidebar. The woman on screen right now is apparently the owner of the house and was saying some things in Estonian, which I don't speak, so who knows? Maybe she was flirting with me, probably not, but you never know. But then, in English, she said that the side gate was open and we could go back there and draw if we wanted to, which I thought was pretty sweet. We didn't go back there, though, because, I was being a little petulant. Anyway, where was I? Okay, so today, it wasn't any of those problems that I've mentioned about the ground or whatever. I was on a pretty flat sidewalk in a quiet neighborhood, so there wasn't much to worry about. That is, except for the sun. This, if you've watched like 4 or 5 videos, you'll know how much grief the sun gives me, and in numerous ways. Usually it's the brightness of the paper, although today that doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. Sometimes it's the lights on, lights off effect, which can change the lighting, obviously, but most notably and annoyingly, it changes the white balance. Kill me. It's awful. I hate that. But today, it was actually the angle. Looking straight ahead, you'd have seen a giant shadow of my face, the one you see here on my right hand, and it would have covered the paper. Every time I'd look up or down, it would move across the paper, and it was either too light or too dark, and it was awful. So I turned my chair 45 degrees to the left and looked at the reference over my right shoulder. Not ideal, but no big deal. Unfortunately, this meant that now the shadow of my phone was front and center and at all times. Not ideal, kind of big deal. So no thank you. So the only options were to move down the sidewalk like 15 feet to get under the shade of a tree, which is kind of a non-starter for the sake of the perspective. I would have been way off to the side. So we didn't do that. Or I could get as close as possible to this little fence behind me, so the shadow of the phone would be blocked by the shadow of the fence. That solves that. But because I'm so close to the fence, that doesn't leave much room for the tripod, which makes setting up the shot a lot more difficult. Add to this the fact that my wife could only stand on the right side, or we'd run the risk of her own shadow casting over the shot. So because the phone is angled to the right, she's on my right, arching over me, trying to see if everything looks okay, setting the exposure and all that, keeping track of time. It was a whole thing. This was all before I sat down to draw, which made the actual drawing, let's just say, not top of mind. We did manage to figure it out, as you can see, but it definitely took me out of the moment. The next thing, although by no means the most significant, is the left side of this door. I really just wish I'd drawn the right and left in tandem, doing one thing on one side and then copying it directly to the other. I don't know if that would be smart. Let me know in the comments if you know. Maybe I'd have an even bigger problem with the drawing had I done that. But what I've done here really just didn't work for me. I spent all that time on the right side, and when I eventually moved to the left, I don't know, I wasn't being as patient, my proportions were off, and it felt like each thing I added ruined it that much more. I wasn't terrible by any means, but I was way too deep in my head at this point, and it was seriously coming out in the drawing. And now we reach the tipping point. Those other things, I could have tolerated all that, but this is where we start to pull at the Jenga block that topples the whole thing. Will it sound kind of moronic? Without a doubt. Will it sound overdramatic? Indeed it will. The thing that drove me crazy was the prospect of drawing all of these godforsaken lines. It's all these panels on this building. And I know, it sounds stupid. I know it. But there's something maddening about drawing a bunch of lines like these that are meant to be perfectly straight and just messing it all up. Had I brought a ruler with me, maybe I would have continued on, but I don't know. It just felt so absurd to me. Like, am I really going to draw all of these lines? And are they really going to look like these panels? I just rapidly lost interest in this drawing. And the longer I looked for things to pull me back in, the more I found that pushed me further out. The windows, as you well know, the gutter thing, the other million or so horizontal lines. You can see for yourself how strict this whole scene is, and I just had enough. The door was like my saving grace, and I felt like I messed that up already, so where was I to go from here? I think the top of the door thing was another part that I was, I don't know, a little bit more excited to draw. But after all of this stuff, I don't know. I think I was just out of it. And then this mid panel, you can just see how the lines don't match up from left to right. I wish I just, I don't know, I guess drawn straight across, but I don't know how I would have done that without drawing straight through the door. I guess this is an opportunity for me to, understand where I might include a pencil, something that I can use to put down the sketch without, I don't know, dedicating myself to those lines. So yeah, this was obviously not my favorite drawing by any stretch, but honestly, I'm just glad that I'm sticking with it and making this video. When I stopped drawing, I was convinced it was a waste of time, but as I cooled down and revisited what I'd made, I figured it would be so much more wasteful if I didn't make something of it. I decided to see it through because it's just, one more part of the process. You might see my other videos and think, wow, does he ever make mistakes? And I'd say, you betcha, get a load of this. And then I'd question whether or not you really watch any of those other videos. Needless to say, I don't like this very much, but it's just more fuel for the fire. I just need to practice stuff like this more often if I ever want to get better at it. Right, so what do you think? Despite all that stuff I said, should I have kept going? Should I have just seen it through? I think so, but who knows? Maybe it's good to just move on sometimes. Anyway, I really appreciate you for taking the time to watch this one, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.